We tend to think of our history as an upward curve, a story of inevitable success. We left the caves, we built the empires, we invented the internet, and now we control the planet. We are 8 billion strong. Look around you, at the traffic, at the screens, at the sheer, overwhelming mass of human infrastructure. We are legion. We are dominant. We survived. But this confidence, this sense of innate security, is a modern illusion. It is a statistical anomaly built on the thin, fragile foundation of dumb luck and improbable genetic survival. If you could peer back into the deep past, back to the moment where the script of human history nearly ended, you wouldn't see empires or cities or even agriculture. You wouldn't see 8 billion people. You wouldn't see a success story at all. What you would see is us, our direct ancestors, Homo sapiens, scattered, nomadic, highly intelligent, yes, but fundamentally weak in numbers. They were small pockets of conscious thought clinging to existence in a world that was overwhelmingly indifferent, often actively hostile. We had invented the spear thrower, perhaps. We had learned to communicate complex ideas. We were masters of fire and stone. But we had not yet mastered survival itself. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer fragility of that existence. We tell ourselves the story of the Great Migration, the triumphant march out of Africa and across the world. But that march didn't happen instantly, and it certainly wasn't guaranteed. Before we even left the cradle continent in meaningful numbers, something happened that stopped us dead. Something that nearly wiped the slate clean. This is not speculation. This is hard science, written into the deepest layers of your DNA. Every person alive today, you, me, the person sitting next to you, the most remote tribe on Earth, we all share startlingly low genetic diversity. We are, genetically speaking, almost identical compared to other successful mammal species. A chimpanzee population in a single forest valley has more genetic variability than the entire human race combined. What does that tell historians and geneticists? It tells us that we went through a bottleneck, a population crash so severe, so rapid, that our species barely hung on. Think of it like this. If you trace the family tree of every human being alive, you find a single agonizingly thin point about 70,000 to 100,000 years ago. At that point, the number of individuals capable of breeding was horrifyingly small. Academics debate the exact number, but the estimates are terrifyingly low, perhaps fewer than 10,000 breeding individuals globally. Some demographic models, analyzing the severity of the genetic crash, suggest the population of effective breeding pairs, the people who actually contributed to the DNA pool that became us, may have dropped to as few as 1,000 people worldwide. 1,000. Stop. Picture that number. Take the city or town you live in. Imagine every single person in it vanishes. The entire global population of Homo sapiens. The species destined to walk on the moon, to compose symphonies, to harness the atom, was reduced to the size of a small, struggling village. A few desperate groups, hiding in scattered corners of Africa and possibly the Middle East, were the only things separating complex life from total, absolute biological failure. The survival of the human race was not a certainty. It was an incredibly close call. So the question that haunts history is simple. What force on Earth is powerful enough to achieve that level of biological cleansing? What could possibly silence the most adaptable, resourceful creature the planet had yet produced? The answer didn't come from a virus or an asteroid or an invading species. It came from beneath our own feet. If you look at the geography of Southeast Asia today, specifically the northern tip of the island of Sumatra, you will find a lake. It is beautiful, massive, peaceful. It is called Lake Toba. But Toba is not a lake. It is the scar of a monster. It is the caldera of a supervolcano, a creature of geological power that defies human comprehension. And roughly 74,000 years ago, that creature woke up. We talk about eruptions in terms of Mount St. Helens or Vesuvius. Those are firecrackers. Toba was an apocalypse. It was the largest explosive eruption the Earth has seen in the last 2.5 million years. When it blew, it ejected an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of magma. To put that into perspective, that is roughly 6,700 times the volume of the St. Helens eruption. The blast was so violent that the energy released was equivalent to billions of tons of TNT. But the real threat wasn't the lava or the immediate blast zone. The people who were living in India or East Africa, thousands of miles away, didn't die from instantaneous incineration. They died from the silent killer that followed. Imagine you are one of those ancestors. You are walking along a riverbed, maybe in modern-day Kenya or Ethiopia. The day is ordinary. You are worried about securing your next meal, perhaps a small herd of gazelles. Life is hard, but it is comprehensible. Then you feel the tremor. Not a slight shake, but a rolling, oceanic wave through the earth that makes standing impossible. It lasts for days. You don't know what a volcano is. You only know that the world is tearing itself apart. Then the sound. A low, subsonic roar that travels thousands of miles, rattling the bones in your chest, driving every animal into a terrified stampede. It is the sound of a mountain range being unmade. And finally, you look up. The sky is changing, not with smoke, but with a vast, unfathomable cloud that begins to swallow the horizon. It is a mixture of sulfur dioxide and superheated ash, blasted 50 kilometers high, straight into the stratosphere. Within weeks, perhaps days, that cloud, pumped into the global atmospheric circulation, begins to drape the entire planet. It is thick enough to block up to 90% of the sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface in equatorial regions. If you were one of those 1,000 survivors, if you looked up during that terrifying period, you wouldn't see the sun. You would only see a permanent, terrifying, metallic twilight. The day humanity almost ended had begun. And for the vast majority of our species, the light was about to go out permanently. Think about that sound again, the roar that knocked the world off its axis. That was the opening act. The real horror came not with the bang, but with the silence that followed. For the human beings scattered across the planet, a few tens of thousands of us maybe, the sky had become a wound. We were looking not at clouds, but at a permanent, toxic atmospheric curtain, kilometers thick, laced heavily with sulfuric acid aerosols. We call this phenomenon the volcanic winter. And it was fast. This wasn't the slow creep of glacial cycles our ancestors were used to. This was the climate switch being flicked from life-sustaining to planetary freezer in a matter of weeks. The sun, our primary engine, was throttled back to less than 10% efficiency in the tropics, and virtually zero further north or south. You were living in a perpetual winter twilight, but infinitely worse than any winter you've ever known. If we look at the ice core data, if we listen to the geological record, the message is clear and chilling. The average global temperature plunged by somewhere between 5 and 8 degrees Celsius. 5 to 8 degrees. That doesn't sound like much until you realize what that means for a fragile ecosystem already living on a climatic knife edge. That average masks the brutal localized drops, especially in the mid-latitudes, where temperature swings could have been far more severe, closer to 10 or 15 degrees in regions that relied on seasonal warmth. Where you might have had a mild, predictable winter, suddenly you had brutal deep freeze conditions, extending for months longer than normal. The immediate effect: water. If you live near high ground, all that fresh water locked up fast. But the deep terror came from what this cold did to the living world. You see, Toba didn't just kill us with cold, it starved us with darkness. Photosynthesis, the absolute cornerstone of nearly all life on Earth, relies on sunlight. When 90% of that energy source is choked off, the base of the food chain disintegrates almost instantly. Grasses, leaves, the tiny organisms that feed the tiny creatures, they began to wither and die, starved of photons. We're talking about a primal, global ecosystem collapse. Imagine the silence. The deafening, crushing silence of an entire biome dying. First, the primary producers go. Then, the immense herds of herbivores that defined that era, the massive buffalo, the early elephants, the antelope. They starve because their food source has failed. They freeze because they have no fat reserves left, and the metabolic cost of staying warm in the sudden, perpetual twilight is too high. And finally, us. Homo sapiens. We were highly intelligent, yes, masters of fire and rudimentary tools, but we were still, fundamentally, dependent on the successful hunt, on the reliable gather. When the animals you hunt are dropping dead from lack of food, and the plants you gather are frozen solid or coated in toxic, acidic sludge falling from the sky, your civilization, your small, struggling band, has maybe a month, maybe two, before the real calculations begin. The vast majority of our kind were doomed not by the direct blast of Toba, but by the secondary, terrifying mechanism of starvation and exposure. Where were we during this catastrophe? That's where the story gets deeply personal. We were not a unified global species yet. We were scattered. Most of our kind, the main stem of the human tree, was clustered in Africa, perhaps small, adventurous pockets that had recently pushed into the Arabian Peninsula and down into coastal India. The explosion happened right next to the Indian population, effectively wiping them out or stranding them permanently in the darkness. In Africa, our genetic home, Toba's impact was less severe than in Europe or Asia, which were hammered by glacial conditions anyway. But even there, the African climate shifted dramatically. Rainforests turned into arid deserts. Grasslands that supported our hunting turned into bleak, freezing scrub. We were forced into tiny, coastal or highland refugia, small, safe pockets, perhaps near permanent fresh water sources, like river gorges or certain regions of South Africa or the Horn of Africa. Think of yourself, a hunter-gatherer, 74,000 years ago, living in what is now modern Kenya. The world doesn't make sense anymore. The cold is relentless. The rain burns your skin. It's that acidic precipitation dropping out of the atmosphere. Your children are constantly shivering. The herd you rely on hasn't been seen in weeks, or you found their skeletal remains huddled under a rock overhang, having simply starved to death. This wasn't a struggle for resources between tribes. This was a struggle against reality itself. We didn't know it was a volcano 5,000 miles away that caused this. We only knew the gods had abandoned us, or perhaps the world was ending. And in that overwhelming darkness, forced into the few remaining sheltered valleys or caves where some residual warmth or water still existed, the fragmentation of humanity began. Every group was isolated. Communication stopped. Trade stopped. Culture, the things that made us human beyond simple survival, began to crack under the pressure. The only thing that mattered was fire, shelter, and the diminishing hope of finding a fresh kill. The numbers are terrifying, and this is where the genetic evidence hits us hard. This isn't just modeling, this is our DNA talking. Academic consensus suggests that when the Toba bottleneck finally relaxed, the total population of breeding Homo sapiens left on Earth may have been as low as 1,000 to 10,000 individuals. Some models push that lower, closer to just 1,000 breeding pairs. Stop and visualize that, 1,000 people. That is the population of a small modern village. That's how close we came to absolute zero. If just one major disaster had hit that surviving 1,000, if a local plague spread, or if the remaining refugee was permanently taken over by another competing hominin species, we wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be reading this. The experiment would have ended. The world had fundamentally changed. It was frozen, silent, and starved. But the true test of survival was yet to come, because the volcanic winter itself, the 6 to 10 years of darkness, was just the beginning of the horror. What followed was a planetary depression that lasted for centuries, trapping our tiny, flickering species in the deepest evolutionary bottleneck we have ever faced, and ensuring that every single one of us, right down to you and me, carries the genetic shadow of Toba within our DNA. That immediate, blinding terror, the years the sun literally forgot to shine, that was only the opening act. We often focus on the volcanic winter itself, the 6 years of cold and ash, because it's so cinematic, so easy to grasp. Darkness falls, but surviving those first few years, hard as it was, only dumped our ancestors into a crisis that lasted for centuries. This wasn't a quick reboot, this was a planetary depression. The immediate particulate matter, the ash, the dust, that settles quickly, but the real climate killer was the immense amount of sulfur dioxide Toba injected into the stratosphere. We're talking about billions of tons of gas that slowly, over years, converted into sulfuric acid aerosols. These tiny reflective droplets didn't just filter the sunlight, they acted like a permanent, thin white curtain drawn across the planet, reflecting solar radiation back into space. You know how when you put ice in a drink, it melts, but the drink stays cold for a long time? The Toba vent didn't just add one ice cube, it flash froze the world, and then the Earth's own climate systems kicked in, locking that cold down. The average global temperature dropped somewhere between 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, a massive dip that persisted for nearly 1,000 years. This was enough to trigger a global feedback loop, pushing the Earth into the depths of a new long glacial period. Now, imagine you are one of those remaining 1,000. You've weathered the darkness. Maybe you were sheltering in a stable cave system, or maybe you found a deep, protected coastal refuge. You emerge, blinking, looking up at a sky that is still strangely bright white, filtered, and staring out at a world that is fundamentally, brutally different. The ecosystems upon which you depended, the delicate balance that allowed our ancestors to thrive in tropical and subtropical zones, had collapsed. Think about Africa, the cradle of humanity. We weren't running around the lush green plains you see in documentaries anymore. The forests began to thin and die. The mega monsoon systems that fed the Great Lakes and rivers turned unreliable. What had been grassland and forest refuges were now turning into skeletal, arid savanna, swallowed by expanding deserts. The great rivers became shallow, sluggish trickles, or dried up entirely for months at a time. The large mammals, the food source, the clothing material, the tools, they began to die off in staggering numbers, unable to find the vast resources needed to sustain their bodies. This is the moment the true evolutionary pressure cooker started. That tiny flickering flame of human life, perhaps split into maybe 5 to 10 isolated, non-contacting groups across thousands of miles, was now trapped in specialized ecological islands we call refugia. Visualize your tribe, maybe 50 people. You are huddled near a permanent water source, perhaps a coastal estuary in East Africa, or a small deep lake fed by a resilient mountain stream. This small pocket of land is the only place within hundreds of miles where life is sustainable. Every day is a calculation of energy in versus energy expended. You move less. You speak less. The psychological tension must have been immense. The gnawing, chronic anxiety of knowing that resources are not just scarce, they are fundamentally finite and non-renewable until the world fixes itself, and you are not alone in this refuge. Every other animal that survived the volcanic winter is also trapped there with you. You are competing with the surviving prey animals for the limited grasses and water. You are competing with the surviving carnivores who are just as desperate and hungry as you are. And critically, you are competing with other groups of your own species. The models suggest that genetic diversity absolutely plummeted. When a population shrinks this drastically, the genetic bottleneck, it means that harmful mutations that were previously masked by a large gene pool suddenly become visible and expressed. Think of it this way. Everyone you meet is essentially your cousin, perhaps separated by only a few generations. Your pool of potential mates is tiny, and every birth is a massive gamble. This isn't just academic. This is why we, every person alive today, exhibit such strikingly low genetic diversity compared to other large primates like chimpanzees. Chimpanzees have been around longer and have vastly more genetic variety than the entire human species combined. We are, genetically speaking, a dangerously successful clone army descended from that handful of survivors. Every human being on Earth today carries the indelible genetic scar of Toba. But we weren't just fighting the landscape and the animals. We were sharing that skeletal landscape with other hominin species that had been established there for tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. Think about the sheer, terrifying reality. You and your small, vulnerable group of 50 people are clinging to survival in a coastal haven in what is now South Africa. You manage to eke out a living by eating shellfish and following the receding coastline. But what happens when another group, not just 50 people from a different tribe of Homo sapiens, but maybe a pocket of Neanderthals who managed to migrate south during the previous warmth, or a remnant group of archaic Homo erectus, stumbles upon your tiny haven? They are just as desperate, they are just as hungry, and they look different, maybe even fundamentally alien to you. They represent not just competition for the last remaining deer, but a direct, lethal threat to your children's only chance at propagating their genes. Survival demanded brutal, efficient adaptation. We didn't survive Toba because we were the strongest or the fastest in the immediate cold. We survived because of a fierce, desperate ability to adapt to persistent, systematic scarcity. The great human innovation, the thing that saved those $1,000, wasn't fire, which they already had, or tools, which they already used. It was the invention of something far more complex, far more psychologically demanding, and absolutely vital to escaping this 1,000-year environmental prison. An invention born entirely out of starvation. And we call it culture. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't philosophy. When we talk about culture being the thing that saved us from the Toba bottleneck, we are talking about something brutally pragmatic, the invention of a social architecture that could reliably manage systemic risk and persistent scarcity across vast distances. Imagine the planet you inherited, a dust bowl encased in perpetual winter fog. For centuries, the sun was dimmed by perhaps 90% in some regions. We are not talking about a harsh winter that lasts a season. We are talking about 1,000 years of failed growing seasons. The ecosystems didn't just struggle, they collapsed. Grasslands shriveled. Forests became skeletal stands. If you were one of the surviving groups, scattered, perhaps 1,000 individuals here, 500 there, you couldn't rely on the old ways. When resources were abundant, it was fine for neighboring families to compete. But when every single deer was a priceless commodity, competition became extinction. If your tiny clan of 50 starves, the whole human experiment shrinks by 5%. Culture, at this moment, was the invention of a sophisticated cross-group insurance policy. It was a deal, unspoken but universally understood. I will share my meager surplus with you now, because I know that when my hunt fails, your group 300 miles away is obligated to give me just enough to survive. But how do you enforce that deal? When everything is gone, how do you make sure that the distant group keeps their promise years later? You invent symbolic exchange. This is the archaeological record speaking directly to you. Look at the sites we find, particularly in South Africa, refuges like Pinnacle Point or Classy's River. Before Toba, tools were big, sturdy, and somewhat disposable. After Toba, everything changes. Necessity births a frantic drive for efficiency. We stop making huge stone axes that require large chunks of high-quality quartzite. That's wasteful. Instead, we start perfecting the microlith. These are tiny, razor-sharp blades, sometimes smaller than your fingernail, chipped expertly from smaller, more readily available pieces of stone. You don't discard them. You haft them. You embed these fragile, brilliant little blades into grooves cut into bone or wooden shafts, creating highly specialized, highly repairable composite tools. Spears, arrows, scrapers. We were becoming engineers of scarcity. Every strike counted. Every tool had to be modular and replaceable. This is a massive cognitive leap demonstrating foresight, precision, and the ability to teach complex, multi-step processes perfectly across generations. But the most fascinating relics aren't the tools. They are the earliest forms of symbolic currency. We start finding things like carefully perforated ostrich eggshell beads or bits of red ochre, pigment that served no immediate utilitarian purpose, often found hundreds of miles from their geological source. Think about that ochre. Why carry a heavy, useless lump of red rock across a volcanic wasteland? Because it wasn't useless. It was a token. It was evidence. When you encountered a group that had never met you, you didn't just show up saying, "Hey, we are desperate. Please share." You offered a piece of that rare red ochre, or you wore the distinctive shell beads unique to your far-off coastal lineage. This wasn't jewelry. It was a membership card. It signaled, "We are part of the network. We understand the contract. We are trustworthy." These non-utilitarian objects are the physical proof of widespread, interconnected social networks that spanned thousands of square miles. Networks that absolutely had to exist to mitigate local famine. Without these deep social ties, any local drought, any failed hunting season would have wiped out an entire pocket of humanity, and the experiment would have ended then and there. This is why the geneticists estimate that all surviving humans descended from perhaps just 1,000 breeding pairs, or about 3,000 individuals total, globally. That is a terrifyingly small number. It means we were flirting with oblivion for centuries. You weren't just struggling against the environment, you were struggling against genetic collapse. If you are one of those 3,000, the pressure on you to survive, to reproduce, to ensure the survival of your small genetic pool is almost unimaginable. Every mating choice matters. You can't just breed within your immediate family. That leads to weakness. You must rely on the network. You must trade mates as well as food. So, for 1,000 years, this tiny, desperate population hung on. They mastered the art of managing complex, hostile relationships. They learned to rely on symbols and promises more than immediate force. They invented the systems we still use today to manage risk, alliance, exchange, and deep-seated reciprocal obligation. They were held together not by the warmth of the sun, but by the fierce, cold logic of cultural necessity. They survived by becoming hyper-aware of their environment, hyper-efficient in their use of resources, and hyper-social in their organization. They became us, fundamentally. But surviving a 1,000-year winter means that when the sun finally returns, when the volcanic ash settles and the climate starts its slow, arduous rebound, you are still living by the laws of scarcity, even though opportunity is beginning to bloom. The world starts to thaw. The rain returns to what is now South Africa, then East Africa. The megafauna, decimated by the cold, begin a slow recovery. The ancestral homeland is finally viable again. What happens when your small, highly specialized, hyper-efficient group, having just survived global extinction, realizes there is now enough room and perhaps enough weakness in the competing human groups around them to finally expand? After 1,000 years of contraction and holding on, the instinct to grow and conquer suddenly becomes the ultimate imperative. And that is when the greatest migration in human history, the wave that eventually covers every inch of the habitable globe, begins. But first, they had to cross the deserts they had inherited. They had to leave the safety of their coastal caves, armed only with their new, intricate tools, their fragile culture, and the deeply ingrained lesson that to survive, you must secure every advantage, no matter the cost, to whoever is standing in your way. We made it. We survived the ice, the ash, and the millennia of near extinction. Now, imagine standing on the edge of that perfect refuge, the coastal caves that had saved your lineage. Looking inland, the world you inherited was brutal. The environment had been scrubbed clean. And while the recovery brought life back to the coastal plains, inland, the great deserts that had formed during the worst cold snap remained vast, angry, and almost completely impassable. We are talking about hyperaridity. The Sahara, the Arabian Desert, they are all waiting. This is not just a hike, it's an exit, only marginally safer than staying put and watching your resources dwindle. The survival instinct, hammered into us by the Toba bottleneck, demanded growth. You cannot maintain genetic viability with 1,000 people huddled on one stretch of coastline forever. The imperative to disperse was absolute. But how do you cross a desert when you barely have enough water for a week? This is where the true genius of the survivors comes into play. You see, previous waves of early humans had left Africa, going back hundreds of thousands of years. They were explorers, sure, but they ultimately failed to leave a lasting global footprint. They lacked something fundamental. They lacked the calculated efficiency of the Toba survivors. What did we have that they didn't? It wasn't brute strength, it was abstraction. Look closely at the archaeology coming out of those South African sites, places like Blombo's cave. We see sophisticated toolkits, not just rocks bashed together, but composite weapons. This is critical. We weren't carrying one hand axe. We were carrying spears with stone points, meticulously shaped, heated for durability, attached to wood shafts using complex adhesives made from tree resin and ochre. We didn't just invent the knife. We invented the specialized, mass-producible, disposable, and easily repaired weapon system. This change meant that you, the hunter, could now kill larger, faster, and more dangerous prey with less risk and fewer resources wasted. You could hunt with devastating precision. And this technology wasn't just about killing, it was about social structure. Think about the planning involved. Collecting the resin, processing the ochre, heating the stone. That takes time, foresight, and specialized knowledge that must be taught and maintained across generations. It's evidence of a sophisticated, symbolic culture. We were carrying not just tools, but the blueprint for a functioning society in our heads. This is why we, the survivors, chose the coastal route, the so-called southern dispersal route, when we finally started to move around 70,000 years ago. Why attempt the deadly, resource-scarce interior deserts if you don't have to? The coast offered a predictable food source: shellfish, mollusks, crabs. It was a highway, a relentless watery trail leading out of the continent, allowing us to carry our technology and our small, precious population with us. Imagine the journey. You're walking along beaches you've never seen, past cliffs that dwarf your group of maybe 50 people. Every few days, you find another bay, another source of shellfish, another piece of driftwood for your fire. You are following the resources, inch by agonizing inch, driven by the absolute certainty that if you stop, if you fail to expand, you will contract and vanish. And remember, we are moving during a glacial period. The planet is still holding its breath. Global sea levels are significantly lower, maybe 80 to 100 meters lower than today. This exposed vast stretches of continental shelf. The coastline we were following was much wider, but it also meant that the crossing points, the choke points, were now potentially accessible. We move up East Africa, turning northeast. We are moving faster now, perhaps because our specialized hunting techniques are so efficient. We are leaving physical evidence behind, subtle signs that show our presence. The specialized stone points in Ethiopia, the ochre markings. We are pushing into territory that might still harbor other hominin groups. We must stop here and dispel a comfortable myth. This migration wasn't an empty-handed stroll into open land. When Homo sapiens expanded, we entered environments already occupied. We weren't just competing with mammoths. We were competing with archaic human cousins, perhaps late surviving Homo erectus, or different, earlier waves of Homo sapiens that hadn't been through the Toba crucible. And here is the crucial question, the one that makes this dark history. What happens when the highly efficient, hyper-specialized Toba survivors meet groups that are perhaps less technologically advanced, less socially cohesive, but physically tougher or simply established in the best spots? The archaeology is sparse, almost silent on the exact interactions, but the outcome is indisputable. When we, the Toba survivors, met our cousins, we absorbed what little population we could, and we replaced the rest. We were an ecological juggernaut. Our technology, our abstract thought, our ability to plan 3 generations ahead, it gave us an advantage so profound that coexistence became extinction for them. We kept moving, relentless, until we reached the geographical end of the continent, the Horn of Africa. Ahead of us lay the narrow, shallow strait that connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Gate of Tears. This was the final barrier, the point of no return. Looking across that low-lying, maybe 15-kilometer stretch of land and water, you are looking at Asia. You are looking at a world of staggering possibility, but also a world that requires a full, terrifying commitment. If this expansion fails, if the resources on the other side are insufficient, or if the competition is too fierce, there is no going back to the safety of the African coastal refugia. You are about to gamble the entire future of our species, all the hope, all the hard-won survival, on a single terrifying crossing. We survived the end of the world, but could we survive leaving our only home? They waited, they calculated, they prepared. And then they decided it was time to leave Africa, knowing full well that they were committing to a future that involved fighting, conquering, and ultimately overwhelming every other form of human life on the planet. The Great War for the world was about to begin. You crossed the narrow strait, wet and shivering, carrying everything you owned, which isn't much more than some sharpened stones, a fire starter, and the desperate hope of your lineage. You made it. You survived the end of the world back home in Africa, endured the darkness, clung to the coastal scraps, and now you stand on the opposite shore. But standing here, in what we now call Southern Arabia, is not the triumph you envisioned. Look around. This isn't a lush Eden waiting to embrace you. This is an unforgiving, parched landscape, recovering slowly from the global trauma we just endured. The interior is dead desert. The air is dry, and you are exhausted. You are not a large army. You are a ragged collection of families, maybe 100 adults, if we're being generous, and twice as many children. We have to remember the numbers. We are still, at this point, the narrowest point of the bottleneck. We are the survivors of the eruption, the few who made it through the fire and the cold. Geneticists will later look back at this moment in our history, the moment we started walking, and see the catastrophic lack of diversity. You are all closely related. The pool is dangerously shallow. This means every life is critical. Every infected scratch, every failed hunt, every child that doesn't make it past 5 years old is a hammer blow against the collective future of humanity. You are navigating the most dangerous phase of all, the rebound. You escaped extinction, but you are still just a handful of people tasked with repopulating an entire planet. That pressure is almost unbearable. The only sensible option, the one that the evidence shows you took, was not to venture inland. To move into the Arabian interior would be suicide. Instead, you followed the resources. You clung to the shoreline. Think of the coast as a predictable, prehistoric supermarket aisle. It has everything you need to keep moving without requiring complex agricultural knowledge or heavy industry. Tides are regular. You learn the lunar cycle and you know exactly when the ocean will deliver its bounty. Shellfish, clams, mussels, oysters, are an easy, high-protein food source. They don't run away. You don't need a perfect spear, just the ability to spot them and crack them open. This is the southern route. It is the coastal superhighway of the Pleistocene. And you move fast, faster than anyone would have predicted you could travel across such vast distances. You don't know where you're going, but you know you cannot stop. If you settle too long, the local food reserves deplete and your tiny population will starve itself. You have to keep pushing, migrating, looking for the next cove, the next estuary, the next great reef. We are talking about movement spanning thousands of miles in the span of maybe 15,000 years. That sounds slow to us today, but on an evolutionary timescale, that is an explosion. From the arid coasts of Yemen and Oman, you track along the edge of the Arabian Sea. You round the tip of the peninsula and move along what is now the Makran coast of Pakistan. The Persian Gulf, which is now a deep body of water, was a much shallower, marshier, more accessible plain back then due to lower sea levels. This offered another temporary haven, rich in water resources, before you pressed on. You are seeing things no human being has ever seen before. You are naming things no human being has ever named. The stars are different. The animals are bewilderingly new. Your language, that incredible complex language that allowed you to plan the Toba survival and coordinate the crossing, is now being stretched and stressed to describe this alien, astonishing world. And as you move, you fracture. It is inevitable. Your population, desperate for resources, cannot stay centralized. The tribe splits into smaller groups, maybe 50 individuals here, maybe 30 there, each following different coastal features or river systems. The pressures of survival force these groups apart, and the simple fact of distance ensures that they rarely, if ever, see each other again. This is the birth of us. This is the moment that human identity began to diversify. A group breaks off near what we call India. They move south and east, heading towards the lush, terrifying jungles and tropical coasts. Another group keeps to the northwest. Each splinter group begins to develop slight differences in tools, subtle shifts in language, and soon distinct genetic markers. They are all descendants of those few thousand Toba survivors, but they are no longer one tribe. You are witnessing and participating in the most successful colonizing effort in the history of life on Earth. You are literally conquering the globe using nothing but fire, language, and stone tools. You reach the Indian subcontinent, a place of immense environmental diversity. The sheer wealth of wildlife here allows certain groups to finally stop the frantic coastal march and settle into the interior river valleys. They thrive, they multiply. The great gamble is paying off. The population is beginning to tick up. Perhaps now we are a few tens of thousands worldwide, still fragile, but growing stronger. But with this success comes a terrifying realization, a geological certainty that changes everything. You are no longer alone. This whole journey, from the moment you left Africa, has been focused solely on survival against nature, against the cold, against the drought, against the dust. You have been fighting the planet. Now you realize that this vast, astonishing world you have been fighting to inherit is already inhabited. They didn't just survive the Toba cataclysm. They were already established here. They are the older lines of humanity, the ones who left Africa hundreds of thousands or even 1,000,000 years before your ancestors did. They are distant cousins, but distinct species. In the West, entrenched in the punishing cold of Europe and Western Asia, are the Neanderthals. They are heavily muscled, built like tanks to handle the Ice Age conditions, brilliant hunters, and masters of their harsh domain. They already regard the territory you are moving into, the Levant, the Mediterranean Basin, Central Asia, as theirs. Further east, in the deep valleys and high plateaus of what we now call Siberia and possibly Southeast Asia, lurk the mysterious Denisovans. We know almost nothing about them, only fragments of bone and astonishing genetic traces that hint at a vast, successful, yet shadowy empire spanning half the globe. And in the deepest, most remote jungles, particularly on the islands of Southeast Asia, there may still be relict populations of Homo erectus, the original pioneers, the truly ancient ancestors. Imagine the confusion. You, the descendants of the Toba bottleneck, the survivors who just learned to speak and plan with terrifying efficiency, look across a river or see a strange light moving through the trees, and you realize you are looking at another human being. They walk upright. They use fire. They hunt. But they are not us. They look slightly different. Their foreheads recede. Their bodies are different. Their tools are functional, but less intricate than the new techniques you've developed. This wasn't a world waiting to be filled. This was a world already claimed, and now the Great Migration ceases to be just a journey of survival. It becomes a struggle for supremacy. For the first time, you are forced to stare into the eyes of a species that competes directly for the exact same resources your tiny, vulnerable population needs to thrive. The war for the world was about to begin, and your group, with its superior ability to talk, plan, and breed, was the invading force. But first, you have to survive the initial encounter. You smell the smoke of a fire that isn't yours. You see the footprint in the mud. It is definitely human, but it is subtly, terrifyingly wrong. The air changes the moment you see them. It is primal. It bypasses fear and lands squarely on recognition. You thought you were alone. You thought you were the only ones left who could tell stories and plan tomorrow. You were wrong. They are taller than you might have expected, or perhaps just built differently. Thicker bone structure, designed for brute strength in a world where every fight is close quarters and brutal. Look at their hands. They are massive. Their brows are heavy, shielding eyes that look back at you with an intensity that is calculating, territorial, and completely alien. These are not the small bands of Homo erectus that your ancestors might have encountered and easily bypassed thousands of years earlier. These are specialized survivors, honed by millennia of ice and darkness. In Europe, we call them Neanderthals. In Asia, perhaps Denisovans, ghosts we only know from a fragment of bone and a genetic echo. But to you, standing there shivering in the post-Toba climate, they are simply the others. And they are not happy you are here. Remember how vulnerable your population was. That tiny group, maybe 1,000 breeding pairs worldwide, clinging to the coastlines, pushing inland only where the megafauna provided sustenance. Now, imagine running headfirst into a population that already owns those rich hunting grounds. The competition wasn't a skirmish. It was a slow, agonizing chokehold on resources. Look at their tools. They are exquisite in their own way, the Mysterian technique. Carefully flaked stones, functional, efficient knives and scrapers. They hunt huge prey, woolly mammoths, bison, but they do it with risk. They get close. The archaeological evidence suggests that their skeletons carry the telltale injuries of rodeo riders, crushed ribs, snapped collarbones. They wrestled with giants. Now look at your hands. You don't have their raw physical power, but you have the mind that can calculate trajectory. You have the innovation of the spear thrower, the atlatl. You don't have to wrestle the mammoth. You can kill it from 20 yards away. You have refined blades that are twice as sharp, attached to shafts with complex resin and sinew. You are not just building tools, you are building specialized weapon systems. This difference wasn't about strength. It was about calculus. It was about efficiency. We had a cognitive firewall. They didn't. We could gather 50 people, not just 10, and communicate a strategy so complex it involved flanking maneuvers and coordinating actions over several days. We could tell stories not just about what happened yesterday, but about the dangers that might happen next year. The resulting conflict, the one that determined who would inherit the earth, was less a bloody war of extermination and more a demographic avalanche. Think of it like this. Your small, incredibly fragile group of modern humans was forced into a world that was already ecologically saturated by other tough, intelligent human species. But because of the pressures of the Toba bottleneck, we, your ancestors, had been forced to innovate or die. We had to be hypersocial, hyperstrategic, and incredibly adaptable. The Neanderthals? They were perfectly adapted to the cold, specialized, and successful, until the climate shifted, and until we arrived. We didn't just outcompete them, we outbred them. Their populations were smaller, their maturation rates slower. They had fewer children, further apart. Our advantage was not just the spear thrower, it was the ability to gather, protect our young, and have slightly higher birth rates. Over thousands of years, the process was relentless. You find a patch of land. They find a patch of land. Your group thrives, growing from 20 to 30. Their group stays at 20. Soon, your hunting band needs to push into their territory. They defend it fiercely, but your coordinated attack, your projectile weapons, your superior ability to keep your wounded alive, slowly, inexorably, wins the day. The archaeological record shows a terrible, heartbreaking pattern. Where modern humans arrive, Neanderthal occupation abruptly ceases, sometimes after a brief period of apparent coexistence. They are displaced to marginal territories, pushed into harsh refuges until they simply vanish from the record. But we have to pause here because the history is never clean. We didn't just push them out. We didn't just kill them. Look at your own DNA right now. Look closely. Somewhere between 1% and 4% of the genetic material in non-African populations today traces directly back to those people, to the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. We encountered them, yes. We fought them, yes. But we also lay with them. Imagine the tension of that interaction. Two different kinds of humanity meeting for the first time in the frigid landscape. Fear, curiosity, desperation. Sometimes resources were shared. Sometimes children were born. Your ancestors absorbed part of their strength, part of their adaptation to the cold, perhaps even some of the genes that made them prone to certain diseases or gave them certain hair or skin colors. We carry their ghosts inside us. We are hybrids. The war for the world wasn't a clean victory. It was an assimilation. As your group continued its relentless, centuries-long march out of the Middle East and into the vastness of Eurasia, down through India, up into the frozen heart of Siberia, and finally into Europe itself, this pattern repeated itself over and over. Every continent held an older, different kind of human, waiting, and everywhere the thousand survivors of Toba and their descendants, us, won. Not through malice, perhaps, but through necessity. The resources were too thin, the ice too demanding, and the numbers too small for the planet to sustain two competing, intelligent species. You keep moving. The world is getting marginally warmer, but the populations you encounter are getting tougher, smarter, and more desperately protective of their territories. You watch your children grow up knowing nothing but the cold, the hunger, and the constant awareness that the shadow in the woods might look like you, use fire like you, but will kill you without hesitation if you threaten its hunting grounds. You are the last human standing, but the fight is far from over. The world is huge, cold, and still occupied. You smell the familiar tang of burnt wood and drying hides, a sign of settlement, stability, and competition. You know with gut-wrenching certainty that the next valley holds another group that must be bypassed, outwitted, or defeated entirely. You survived the volcanic winter. Now you must survive the other humans, and you are walking straight into the heart of the deepest darkness, the struggle for absolute supremacy on a broken planet. You are walking away from the darkness. You keep moving, but the conflict we talked about, the struggle against the other shadows in the woods, that is the final crucible. It is the defining chapter of your lineage, the moment where the tiny remnant population proves itself not just resilient, but uniquely adaptable, uniquely dangerous. The volcanic winter hammered every human species, but the competition it spawned afterward was evolutionary selective pressure unlike any other. Think about the Neanderthal. Powerful, specialized, perfectly suited for the deep European cold. They had the bulk, the muscle, the brains. Bigger brains than ours, in fact, but they were locked into a specific survival strategy, tailored for environments that were changing too fast. They were excellent sprinters. We were marathon runners. You, the survivor, are defined by an almost terrifying flexibility. You wear animal hides, but you refine your tools faster than anyone else. You don't just use fire, you master it, bending entire landscapes to your will. When you meet the others, the Neanderthals in the frigid European valleys, the mysterious Denisovans deep in the Siberian caves, it is not a clash of civilizations, but a slow, cold war of attrition over resources that barely exist. And we won. We didn't win because we were inherently better people. We won because, in those desperate conditions, we figured out how to cooperate on a larger scale, maintain wider trade networks, and communicate abstract concepts, complex enough to allow a handful of families to outplan and outmaneuver populations that were individually stronger. We didn't just bypass them, we absorbed small, critical pieces of them. That tiny fraction of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA running through most of our veins today? That's the echo of that moment. A whisper of interbreeding, a desperate exchange of genetic material in the twilight of their existence, a final connection before they vanished. Their story ends when yours begins its resurgence. Look at you now, emerging from the bottleneck. You have passed through the narrowest door in human history, shedding almost all of the genetic diversity that once defined our scattered species. And this is where the science hits you, right in the gut, with chilling certainty. Because we know exactly how close we came. We don't need dusty scrolls or ancient ruins to prove the Toba catastrophe happened. We just need to look inside ourselves. The staggering lack of genetic diversity in modern humans is the fingerprint of the catastrophe. Compare us to chimpanzees or gorillas or even other large mammals. They possess vast, deep genetic variation. We are nearly identical to one another, genetically speaking. This astonishing uniformity proves that our species, Homo sapiens, did not descend from a large, flourishing population. We descended from a tiny handful of people. A population so small, so isolated, that we effectively erased almost everything that came before. Scientists estimate that at our lowest point, at the throat of the bottleneck, there were only between 1,000 and 10,000 breeding pairs left on Earth. That is the consensus. That is the terrifying fact. Everything you are, everything we have ever built, every dream, every tragedy, it all springs from that tiny, fragile group of survivors who endured the volcanic winter. If one single environmental factor had shifted just slightly more, if the cold had lasted another decade, if the monsoon routes had failed entirely, if the other hominin species had pressed their advantage harder, we would not be here. The chain would have broken. You are the walking, talking embodiment of a miracle of sheer dumb luck and brutal, cunning adaptation. But the trauma never truly leaves. We carry the echo of the bottleneck in our cultural memory, in our instincts. The constant, almost neurotic need for resources, the intense tribalism, the deep-seated, often irrational fear of the other. These are not flaws in our system. They are features forged in the furnace of near-extinction. You had to be paranoid. You had to be protective. You had to see every stranger as a potential competitor for the handful of resources keeping your children alive. And as the climate finally begins its agonizing, slow recovery, you start to move again, galvanized by the experience. You are leaving the cradle of humanity, marching out of the environmental sanctuaries in Africa or the Near East, carrying sophisticated new stone and bone tools, new languages, and a new resolve. The world is still huge, but you are finally numerous enough, organized enough, and ruthlessly efficient enough to populate it. From those few thousand souls, our numbers begin their unstoppable expansion. First a few thousand, then tens of thousands, then millions. We march across Asia, across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, across the open ocean to the farthest islands. Every corner of the planet you look at today, every civilization, every language, every face, it traces its roots back to that 1,000-year nightmare. We are all cousins, bound by the memory of the ash and the cold, connected by the incredibly thin thread of DNA that survived when 99.9% of the genetic library of humanity was discarded. The world that almost killed us ended up perfecting us. It stripped away the excess, sharpened the edges, and gave us the singular determination to never again be vulnerable. We became the ultimate survivors. So when you look at our history, don't just see the pyramids or the wars or the great works of art. See the ash cloud 74,000 years ago. See the freezing night sky. See that original group of people huddled around a failing fire, knowing they might be the last intelligent beings left on the planet. You are not the inheritor of a grand design. You are the improbable descendant of a desperate struggle. We survived the day the world tried to erase us. We endured the deepest darkness, and we earned our place here through sheer, uncompromising will. The fight for survival is over. Now begins the fight for everything else. And it all started with 1,000 of us refusing to die.